If you've ever felt responsible for everyone's happiness, at work or at home, this episode is for you. This is the Lawyer Burnout Solution, the podcast for female attorneys who want to stay in the careers that they've worked so hard to build without running themselves into the ground. I'm Heather Mills, and every week I'll share the tools, strategies, and mindset shifts you need to reclaim your energy, confidence, and career. One of my clients, let's call her Maya, came to her coaching call recently asking if we could talk about a personal situation instead of work. And of course I told her, everything is on the table in coaching and it's all connected. But she was feeling stressed about her cousin and her cousin's boyfriend coming to visit her in New York City from Denmark. And she wanted to make sure they were going to have a really great time. She wanted to help them create a fun itinerary, but it was a busy time at work. And she wasn't sure she was going to be available when they wanted to come. I asked her, well, what's the worst thing that they would think about her if they didn't have a good trip? She paused and she thought, well, they might say that I'm not a good cousin or that I'm too self-important to take time off or be available. And I asked her, well, did her cousin say any of this to her? Maya admitted, no, they hadn't said anything. This is a perfect example of what I call excessive responsibility. It's where we feel responsible for things that are outside of our control. And it's not just personal, it shows up in our work lives too. In fact, excessive responsibility is one of the main contributors to burnout. When we overcommit ourselves because we're trying to control outcomes or manage other people's emotions, we end up neglecting our own needs. We end up neglecting our own goals and dreams. Why do we do this? Why do we take on other people's problems and their tasks and their work, all the stuff that's not really ours to take on, and to our own detriment? There are 4 main reasons that excessive responsibility happens. The first reason is because of our socialization. You're going to hear me talk about this a lot. As women, we are socialized to prioritize other people's needs over our own. Society teaches us that our worth is tied to how much we do for others and that we need to be selfless. And that shows up in subtle ways like being praised for being helpful or caring. While when we try to assert ourselves or prioritize our own needs, that might be labeled as selfish. At work, this might look like taking on the emotional labor of smoothing over the conflicts between coworkers. Have you ever done that? I know I have. At home, it might look like managing all the household logistics like groceries, bills, doctor appointments, kid activities, all on your own, even when you have a partner who could help share the load with you. This leads us to believe that we're only valuable when we're sacrificing ourselves for others. And that creates a cycle of overcommitment and guilt and resentment when we try to set boundaries. The second reason is because of misplaced responsibility. We think we're responsible for things that are not actually ours to control. So when we think to ourselves, I need them to think I'm competent or they're going to judge me, we're trying to control other people's thoughts. When we think, I don't want them to be upset or disappointed in me, we're trying to control other people's emotions. When we think, if I just work harder, I know I can guarantee my success in this situation, we're trying to control the outcomes that we may be able to influence, but ultimately don't control. This misplaced responsibility creates so much stress and anxiety because we're trying to control things that are inherently unpredictable. When my kids were young, I had a lot of work to do around this issue of excessive responsibility. I really had this idea that I could control their behavior, and birthday parties was when it really showed up. I wanted so badly for them to dress how I wanted them to dress and behave how I thought was appropriate with other kids and in front of other parents, because I was feeling inadequate as a mom and was trying to prove what a good mom I was. That, of course, didn't go well and created a lot of suffering for all of us. So I had to do some work to manage my thoughts around that. And now I can say that parties are not an issue. They get to be who they are and wear what they want to wear and act crazy if they want to. And I can love them for the beautiful humans that they are. The third reason excessive responsibility happens is fear of judgment. Our fear of judgment causes us to project our own self-critical beliefs onto other people. We assume people will think the worst of us if we don't meet our own impossibly high standards. So an example of this is when we think, if I don't take on this extra project, my colleagues will think I'm lazy or not pulling my weight or difficult. If I don't volunteer for this committee, they'll think I'm not a team player or not committed enough. But these fears usually come from our own critical brain, not from actual feedback. We're so worried about being seen as incompetent or selfish that we overcommit to prove ourselves. And that leads to perfectionism and people-pleasing that drain our energy and reinforce this belief that we're never doing enough. The fourth reason is magical thinking. Magical thinking is the belief that if we work hard enough or do everything perfectly, we can create the perfect outcome and avoid those emotions that we don't want to feel, like guilt, shame, anxiety. Magical thinking starts when we're kids. We lack the tools to process our negative emotions, so we literally just make stuff up that makes us feel better. Here's what I thought as a kid. If I get straight A's and follow all the rules, my parents will never be disappointed in me. And as an adult, this later translated into, if I do everything perfectly at work, no one will ever be upset with me. The problem, of course, is that nobody's perfect, and negative emotions are just part of being human. No matter how hard we try, bad stuff's going to happen. And trying to avoid anxiety, guilt, and shame by overcommitting just leads to burnout. So these 4 reasons, socialization, misplaced responsibility, fear of judgment, and magical thinking, altogether they create a perfect storm of excessive responsibility. They teach us that other people's needs matter more than our own, that we're responsible for things that are outside of our control, that we have to constantly be proving ourselves to avoid judgment, and that we can somehow escape negative emotions by doing more and being perfect. And that leads down this path of self-sacrifice and resentment and ultimately burnout. Now let's go back to Maya. Remember how she admitted that her cousin never said that Maya was a bad cousin or that she was too self-important? When Maya heard herself say that out loud, she laughed because it was funny to think that her cousin would even say something like that. Maya's brain was projecting her own self-critical thoughts onto her cousin. So I asked Maya if she thought that that was really true. Was she a bad cousin? Did she think she was more important than other people? And she laughed again. No, she didn't really think that. And was she really in charge of whether her cousin and boyfriend had a great trip? Of course not. Maya wasn't controlling the weather or handpicking the food or curating the museum exhibits. If her cousin didn't like the New York City vibe or thought the Bagels were really too hyped up, then that was on her cousin. So in saying these things out loud, Maya could really see that the things our brains want to convince us of are somewhat ridiculous, silly. We can laugh at them. Now, Maya started seeing how this pattern was playing out in her work too, because she just brought in a new client at work. She was a senior associate at a mid-sized firm, and it was no small thing to bring in a new client. But the case got assigned to other associates because of specialties and caseloads, so she wasn't working on the case at all. And she found herself constantly worrying about how the case was progressing and whether or not they had a winning strategy. And she disagreed with their approach and felt anxious that if things didn't go well, the client might blame her, or worse, lose faith in the entire firm. She kept thinking, what if they think I brought them here just to hand them off to someone who doesn't care? She felt torn between wanting to intervene and not wanting to overstep. And what if they lost the case? She worried it would be her fault. But when we took a deeper look at her thoughts about this, I asked her, did this client expect you to personally oversee every detail of the case? She recognized that the client had not said anything like that, and that she couldn't be responsible for the ultimate outcome of the case. Maya saw that her overwhelming sense of responsibility wasn't coming from her clients, her colleagues. It was coming from her own brain. Her brain was projecting fears of inadequacy and self-criticism onto other people, making her feel like she had to control everything to prove her worth. When we do that, it doesn't really ever allow our minds to truly rest. There's always another task we could be doing, another person we could be pleasing. And that prevents us from connecting with ourselves and knowing what we actually want for our lives and working toward our own goals and dreams. It's kind of ironic that by attempting to control everything, we feel less in control of our own lives. And that makes us feel helpless and stuck. So how do we break free from this pattern? How do we let go of excessive responsibility and focus on what we can control? That's where the concept of autonomous accountability comes in. I know that's a mouthful. Let me explain what I mean by autonomous accountability. Autonomous means having the freedom and agency to control what's ours. Accountability means holding ourselves responsible for the outcomes and goals and dreams that we have for our own lives. So it comes down to recognizing that we're in control of our own thoughts, emotions, actions, decisions. But in order to focus on that, you have to believe that you're inherently worthy, that you matter, so that you can push back against that belief that your worth is dependent on how much you do for other people. So one way to push back is to make some lists. It's just a simple way to start. The first list I recommend you make is a list of all the places that your sense of responsibility might come from. So was it your family? Did you feel responsible for your parents' well-being or for their feelings or for your siblings? For some people, their culture or their religion had a big impact on them because it might have emphasized duty, self-sacrifice, putting others first. Or if you grew up with limited resources, if you grew up in poverty, that might have forced you to feel responsible far too early. And if you're part of the legal industry, it's an industry that rewards overwork and constant availability, and that reinforces our pattern of over-responsibility. So the second list to make is a list of things that are truly within your control at work. Write down what are the outcomes from the work that you do on a day-to-day basis where you control the outcome. You can put that on one side of the page, and on the other side of the page, what are the outcomes at work that you influence but don't ultimately control the end result? Seeing it on paper really helps you see how and where you're overcommitting. Okay, so the second way to push back against feeling excessively responsible is to be willing to feel negative emotions. I know, right? Yeah, feeling our feelings and recognizing that guilt and anxiety are part of being human. So we can stop trying to avoid these emotions by overcommitting and just allow ourselves to experience them without judgment, without beating ourselves up for having them. So when you make this shift from feeling responsible for everyone and everything to becoming accountable for what's truly yours, you reclaim your energy, you recover from burnout, and start thriving in your career. If you found this episode helpful, make sure to hit follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you can get the next episode. I'm here every week with strategies to help you reclaim your energy, your confidence, and your career from burnout. If you know another lawyer who needs to hear this conversation, maybe someone who's feeling overwhelmed, overcommitted, or just plain exhausted, please share this podcast with them. You never know who might need to hear this today. Let's help more lawyers thrive, not just survive. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. Remember to be kind to yourself this week, and I'll see you next week.